Greetings to everybody that's participating in this year's OCCD conference. My name is Bill Rotert. I'm a consultant with Corporate Facts, does a lot of technical assistance work for HUD. Prior to that, I was with HUD for 38 years in the field. And I want to give a special thanks to Donna Everson for inviting me to join you today to celebrate a rather remarkable achievement. This is the 50th anniversary of the CDBG program, created by the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. So this is a special occasion, and we thought we'd mark it a little bit differently than most of the time. I was there when CDBG was created 50 years ago, and I would like to share with you a little history about what it was like before CDBG, how the program was created, and then a few thoughts about where it has gone since then. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you back to the age of dinosaurs, prior to 1974, when the Housing and Community Development Act was passed. Next slide, please. What was it like prior to 1974? Well, we had two presidents that worked on this thing called CDBG. One was Richard Nixon, and the other was Gerald Ford. We had two secretaries of HUD, George Romney, Mitch Romney's father, and James Lynn, Secretary of HUD when it was actually passed. Back then, what is now the Office of CPD was called the Office of Metropolitan Development. And as a rep in Oklahoma, I dealt with 8 separate, what are called categorical programs: urban renewal, neighborhood development program, model cities, and then some smaller programs called historic preservation, water and sewer grants, public facility loans, open space grants, and neighborhood facilities. All were separate programs. Most of them required a match. Most of them required a 50-50 match, either in cash or in non-cash, where you demonstrate you've already spent or prepared to spend money alongside it in order to meet the cash match. There were separate rules for each of these programs and separate pots of money. So when money ran out for, say, open space in Oklahoma, that was it. You couldn't borrow from urban renewal or public facilities or water and sewer. Separate pots of money for each program. Each one of these programs was operated on a competitive basis each year. So we'd let people know what the criteria would be for selecting the winning applicants. And then we had a competition and we decided who was going to be funding. Obviously, what that meant to those of you at the local level is that there was funding uncertainty. You never knew from one year to another whether you might win in one of these competitions. The programs were highly prescriptive. They were very narrow. You had no flexibility in terms of how you funded your individual projects. And there was no long-term planning, and you can understand why, because you never knew from year to year what you might win and what you might not win. So it made things quite difficult to think in the long term. Next slide. So how did this transition occur in 1970? How did we go from those categorical programs to CDBG? Well, first of all, there were a series of political hurdles that needed to be dealt with. We had to bring Congress along, and there were some folks used to the old way of doing things, and they were reluctant to make a change. There were lots of interest groups out there that had a say-so in this transition. The urban renewal people were represented by NARO at the time. There was no National Community Development Association at the time. The housing industry always had a significant say in anything that happened at HUD. And then also the public works and public facilities people were concerned about this change. Congress very clearly, when they created CDBG, they looked out there and found that city after city, low-income neighborhood after low-income neighborhood, the physical conditions in those neighborhoods were deplorable. No paved streets, no water and sewer, no storm sewer, no parks, etc. So they created the program with the infamous 3 national objectives that I'm sure everybody's familiar with: low and moderate income benefit, slums and blight, which was intended to be a way for people to complete urban renewal activities that didn't meet the low mod income benefit test, And then lastly, urgent needs, which comes into play normally when there's a natural disaster of some sort. But it's important to recognize that Congress maintained that emphasis on low and moderate income benefit throughout. And that's what we all come to know as the primary benefit test, or the 70% rule. It says, taken as a whole, your program, 70% or more of your money must be spent for low and moderate income benefit activities. There were some significant funding issues that had to be overcome in order to make the transition. Some cities had done quite well in competition for those categorical programs. And when someone came along and said, well, you're going to only get your formula amount, and that amount was significantly less than what they got with urban renewal or model cities, they were reluctant to make the change. So the answer to that was something they called hold harmless. They went to all those communities and said, if your funding under the categorical programs was higher than the formula amount you'll get with CDBG, you will start at your higher amount first, and over a period of 5 years, you'll gradually get to where you are now at your formula amount. And it worked pretty well. And then they built in some restrictions that I'm sure we're all aware of. They wanted to put a limit on general admin and planning, 20%. They wanted to put a limit on public services. They did not want CDBG to be primarily a public service program, although they did recognize public services have a role to play in community revitalization. And then lastly, there are lots of housing programs available through HUD and elsewhere. They did not want CDBG to be just another housing program. So as you know, they put some limitations on new housing construction in the CDBG program. And that gave rise to what we now think of as the CBDOs, community-based development organizations. And then lastly, what I like to call the Warren Butler rule, who was one of the people most responsible for creating CDBG, and that is he insisted that the decision-making role for CDBG would be at the local level and not the federal level. He made it clear to us field staff that we were no longer to dictate to communities how to spend their money. And I think that was a giant step forward. Next slide. I want to take you back for just a minute and remind you what the primary purpose of CDBG was when it was created. Title I of the Housing and Community Act of 1974. And it states that it's about development of viable urban communities. You're going to hear me mention that again. Viable urban communities by providing decent housing, suitable living environments, and expanded economic opportunities, principally for persons of low and moderate income. Viable urban communities. Next slide. So what was the new world of CDBG all about? Well, first of all, you got funding certainty. This program's been around 50 years, and you could pretty much rely on getting funding from year to year. It started out as two programs, what was earlier called the Small Cities Program, what is now the state CDBG program, and then the entitlement program for larger cities that were going to get a formula amount. For the first time, it allowed people like you to do long-term planning because you had reasonable funding certainty going on, and you could plan your programs for the long term, not just for the immediate term. There's a broad range of activities. Everything that was eligible under all 8 of those categorical programs was folded into CDBG. I used to tell people it's easier to know what you cannot do with CDBG than what you can do with CDBG. Next, it insisted on local input and control. That's the birth of citizen participation and shareholders or stakeholders in the program. And then making sure that the final say is local and not HUD. There's no applications in this program. Go figure. A federal program without an application. As you all know, we now just develop a consolidated plan, typically a 5-year plan, with annual increments, the annual action plans. There's a single set of program rules, and I was thinking as I was putting this together, those rules haven't changed a lot in 50 years. 24 CFR Part 570 has remained relatively stable. There's minimal oversight by HUD. A good example is HUD doesn't require you to submit source documentation with all your draws. We just ask you to maintain it so that we can look at it if we come out to monitor. And lastly, we are all reminded that there are a variety of federal requirements that come with any federal program, including CDBG. the OMB requirements at 2 CFR 200, NEPA, the Uniform Act, Davis-Bacon, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and the like. So there's a lot of rules that come with CDBG. Next slide. So let me tell you what I like most about CDBG after working with it for 50 years. The flexibility that's built into the program that we talked about leads to incredible creativity. And that leads to what we often refer to as best practice. I could go on for hours talking about the best practices we awarded when I was in Kansas City. Great creative use of CDBG and related programs. I want to share with you briefly the two favorites that I have. The first is the Wichita Cessna 21st Street Job Training Program. They came to us and needed a Section 108 loan guarantee to build a new job training facility, only it wasn't going to be out on the airport property where Cessna was located. It was going to be in the lowest income neighborhood in Wichita. They were going to give everybody in the program a stipend to live on. Everybody in the program was covered by health insurance. Everybody in the program was given individual counseling as needed. And probably the single most creative thing about it is to get on the program, you had to have been on public assistance, what was then referred to as welfare assistance. So they were taking people who had had a lifelong problem with succeeding. And the final best part of it is if you completed the program, you were guaranteed a job on the assembly line at Cessna, making a really good wage with really good benefits. That's the Cessna Wichita Job Training Program, a great program with literally hundreds of graduates now working at Cessna. And then the second one I wanted to share with you was the Detroit NRSA. A number of years ago, we were asked to help with the city of Detroit going through bankruptcy program or bankruptcy process. And we were asked to look at their housing and community development department to come up with some recommendations that we think would serve them well down the road. They had a brand new mayor, I might add. And after we had looked at the way the city was operating, we were concerned that they were spreading the money around too much and not having any meaningful impact on individual neighborhoods. So we talked to the new mayor about what we now know as neighborhood revitalization strategy areas, targeting your money in smaller areas over a shorter period of time in order to have a meaningful impact to make what the law required, viable urban communities. A key part of that was a home repair program. The mayor insisted that it not be free, that it not be outright grants, that they be reduced interest rate loans. I looked on the website just recently, and the mayor announced that they have enough money now to do 12,000 single-family housing rehabs in Detroit. That's a remarkable turnaround for a city that lost 1 million people in a relatively short period of time. So those are my two favorite best practices, and I bet you have your favorites as well. Next slide. Not so fast. I have two major criticisms of the program, and I'm going to share those with you now. The first is what the law and the regulations are historically referred to as maintenance of effort. Don't forget, CDBG was created to supplement local resources, not replace them or supplant them. I have known of a number of communities where they came to rely on CDBG for all their public works and public facilities, and weren't putting the local dollars into those neighborhoods they otherwise would do. That technically is a violation of the law and the regulations. It's called maintenance of effort. So be sure you don't fall into one of those groups. And the second is what one of my field reps once called the warm margarine approach to community development. It's the antithesis of the Detroit situation, or NRSAs, where grantees over time tend to spread their money around too thinly on too many activities, so it has no meaningful impact on any individual neighborhood. Don't forget, fundamental purpose is to create viable urban communities. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at ways to concentrate your resources in order to maximize the impact over a relatively short period of time. Next slide. So where are we today? I got to thinking about this, and I realized in a certain way, we could say we've kind of returned to the pre-CDBG days of categorical programs. We have the existing CPD programs such as CDBG, the regular program, the home program, the SNAPS programs or the homeless programs, HOPWA. If you're in a natural disaster, you're probably dealt with DR, disaster recovery funds. There's the CARES Act, the NSP program when we went through the real estate crisis, more recently the ARP funding, and the list goes on and on. And it's just an interesting question. Have we gradually somehow returned to the era of categorical programs? I got to thinking about it, and I was wondering, are there any things under these separate programs that can't already be done under the regular CDBG program? Just a little food for thought. Okay, last slide. I want to deal with something that I've been asked on a number of occasions, and I bet you have too. Has this CDBG program made a difference over 50 years? We still have lots of problems in those inner city neighborhoods and elsewhere. And my resounding answer to that is yes. Don't forget that CDBG was designed primarily to address substandard physical conditions in low-income neighborhoods. A lot of other issues are left to other resources and other programs, but CDBG was primarily intended to be a way to deal with substandard physical conditions. Having driven those neighborhoods back in my days as an urban renewal planner, I mentioned to you how bad the conditions were. I could drive those same neighborhoods today, and while there were still obvious problems, most of the physical conditions have been addressed. We've dramatically improved the public facilities like streets, water, sewer, parks, etc. We've rehabbed tens of thousands of homes with single-family housing rehab, one of my favorite CDBG program options. We've created tens of thousands of jobs with economic development and special economic development activities funded with CDBG. And lastly, I think we could all say that there are hundreds of deserving best practice success stories around the country. So I think as you look back on 50 years of CDBG, the answer is clearly yes. The job is not finished. It's an ongoing job that needs to be attended. But I am delighted to have been associated with this program for that long period of time. With that, I'm going to close out, and I'm going to wish all of you well. Let's hear it for another 50 years of CDBG. Thank you very much.